Hello, everybody, and welcome to this next edition of the Reach Films podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Fagan, and today we're talking all about the 2020 M1 MacBook Air. Now, the M1 MacBook Air has actually been out for over 2 years now. It was released on November 10th, my birthday, on 2020, and this was a very revolutionary computer because not only was the M1 Macs, they were the first computers that across the board, no matter what M1 computer you had, you pretty much had the same processor and GPU power. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer out there, and if you got the base model of the M1 MacBook Air or the Mini, you did get one bin GPU core. However, for the most part, like I said, they were the first computers that had the same processor across all of them. Now, until this M1 MacBook Air came out, I wasn't really interested in MacBook Airs because in the Intel days, there would be various processors throughout the various MacBook Airs. They wouldn't be as powerful as the MacBook Pros, and they didn't have the same graphics performance as a lot of the other computers, which all changed with the M1 MacBook Air. And not only has it been the best value MacBook pretty much still to this day, but they're still selling these things, which is pretty crazy after 2 years. After the M2 MacBook Air has already been released, the base model MacBook Air, which this is still the best value laptop for the money here in 2022. So in today's video, what I want to do is I want to talk about my use cases with the M1 MacBook Air because as you can see from right here, the M1 MacBook Air, although I use it, it's not my main computer. I actually use a 5K iMac, and I'll put a link in the description below in the video where I talk about why I use the 5K iMac, which is an Intel computer, as my main editing rig. But I use the M1 MacBook Air all the time, from needing a portable laptop, from being able to edit on the go, whether I'm on a gig, whether I'm on vacation and I need to do a little bit of editing while I'm gone, to having a DIT computer on gigs, to also using it as my server computer here in the home studio. I do use this as a server when I'm here, and I'll explain all of that and more. But number one, I want to talk about the value proposition of the M1 MacBook Air versus the M2 base model specifically. Now, you can pick up this M1 MacBook Air right now. It's almost Black Friday. They're running deals on them brand new for $800. Now, you can pick up an M2 MacBook Air for on Black Friday discount for around, I got it right here, $1,050. So it's $250 more, and you could do the jump from an M1 MacBook Air to an M2 MacBook Air. And so a lot of people are probably going to look at that. You're going to see the new. Let me pull up right here. Let me pull up the screen so I can show you what I'm looking at. Let's do screen 2. There we go. So here's the M1 MacBook Air. As you see on Amazon, it's $800 right now. But then if we go look at the M2 is $250 more, but it does have the new body style, and it does have a little bit more of a powerful M2 processor. It definitely is going to be more powerful. So I think a lot of people's question is going to be, why wouldn't I spend the extra $250 and get the M2 MacBook Air over the M1 MacBook Air? And it's actually an interesting situation. So logically, you would think that with the more powerful processor of the M2, the extra $250 is worth it. However, if you're specifically looking for a base model M2 MacBook Air, not a spec'd out MacBook Air M2, but a base model, the base model M2 MacBook Air is actually a little bit slower than a base model M1 MacBook Air. And the reason this happened is actually very simple. So as you see, the base configuration of the M2 has a 256 gigabyte hard drive, just like the base model of the M1. Now also, both the M2 and the M1 base model MacBook Airs have 8 gigabytes of RAM, which means that if you're a video editor, you're doing any kind of intensive work on your laptop, if you only have 8 gigabytes of RAM, fortunately, the Apple Silicon ARM-based Mac computers can handle it, but they use what's called swap memory. And with swap memory, I'll put some videos on it in the links below after this live stream is done. But to simplify it, it uses your hard drive or your SSD of your computer to give yourself the extra RAM performance that you would have basically be missing by only having 8 gigabytes of RAM versus 16. Now, on the M1 MacBook Air, as you see, there's 256 gigs. Actually, I think they're only selling the 256 gigs on Amazon because they're only selling the base model. But it comes with 256 gigs, but of the 256 gigs, you actually have two 128 gigabyte SSD chips in the computer. So you're being able to pull resources from two 128 gigabyte drives. Where on the M2 MacBook Air, although the specs are similar with the more powerful M2 processor, they are actually only giving you one 256 gigabyte SSD drive in the M2 MacBook Air, which means if you're doing any kind of video editing or any intensive task and you're using a base model MacBook Air M1 or M2, you're going to get better swap memory performance out of a base model M1 MacBook Air versus the M2. So that's number one of why the M1 MacBook Air is still the best value Apple laptop here in 2022. Because even though the M2 has a more powerful processor, unless you step up to 16 gigs of RAM and honestly a 512 gigabyte hard drive, you're not really going to see as much of a performance boost as you would think jumping up to the M2 MacBook Air. And then before we go too far into it, the other key factor in this is the fact that if you jump up, and I'm just going to pull this off the screen, if you jump up to an M2 MacBook Air and you do those performance upgrades, you're basically starting to encroach on the price of an M1 Pro MacBook Pro or an M1 Ultra MacBook Pro, although the M1 Ultras are more expensive. But you're starting to go at least to the M1 Pro pricing. You're getting very close. And at that point, if you're using this as your main computer, you probably want to step up to the M1 Pro, even though the M2 sounds more enticing for the price. The other thing, too, is when you spec out your M2 MacBook Air, you're starting to encroach on the price of a Mac Studio, to the point of you're even getting to the same price of a base model MacBook Studio that's refurbished. So then you kind of have to ask yourself, what's the use of the computer? And if this is going to be your main computer and you don't need portability, well, then the money's kind of better spent on a studio, a Mac Studio, for the same price. Now, without getting too much into the other videos I've already covered, I actually use, like I said, a 5K iMac. It's an Intel, the last 5K 27-inch iMac they made before Apple did the transition to M1. But I needed a laptop for portability reasons. Now, the reason I went with a desktop, which is why some of you may want to as well, is the fact that when I was home, until I bought this computer, the 5K iMac and the MacBook Air in 2020, for over 10 years, I was always purchasing 15-inch MacBook Pros. And when I would use them on the go, two things would happen. Number one, I wouldn't use them for the most of their ability. I wouldn't be doing complex edits on the go. I would be using it as an everyday computer, bringing it to the office, bringing it on vacation, whatnot. After a while, that computer started to be a little cumbersome in the weight and the size. I didn't really need a 15-inch laptop when I was on the go. And that's why when I was looking at the prices, it ended up making the most sense for me to get a MacBook Air because of how small it was, but also it was powerful enough for me to do basic edits on the go. I've edited weddings on this. I've edited YouTube videos. I've edited trailers for features and short films. If you're editing on Final Cut or DaVinci, the base model M1 MacBook Air, even if you're on a budget especially, can absolutely do it. You just have to deal with its quirks. Now, when I have much bigger projects, then obviously, yes, I think the M1 MacBook Air will start to slow down on you, especially when it comes, more than anything, it's actually not in the editing that it will slow down on you. It's going to be in the export of that video, especially if you're going to do a 4K or higher export. That's where you're going to get a lot really slowed down with this machine. And so where my recommendation comes in for an M1 MacBook Pro is if you're like me and you want a Mac that you can use as your portable travel computer, but you don't want to break the bank because you have a primary computer, I think the M1 MacBook Air base model is still an absolutely great value, and I still recommend it. If you're on a budget and you need a laptop, but you can't afford to jump past the M1 MacBook Air essentially in price, but you need an Apple computer, and the M2, the only thing you can afford as far as an M2 MacBook Air is the base model, well then I would still choose the M1 MacBook Air. But if you really need the lightweightness of the MacBook Air, but you're willing to invest a little bit more into it and spend more than the base model M2 MacBook Air, if you're going to spec your MacBook Air at all, then the M2 makes a lot of sense. But again, when you spec it out, it ends up almost being twice the price of what this is on Black Friday. So let's talk about some of my uses now that we've gone through this whole comparison of where and when, what the differences are with the M1 versus the M2 MacBook Air. So my uses, of course, I've already spoken about travel computer. I've already spoken about a little bit using it as my server, which I'll dive into a little bit more. And then obviously my portable editing computer as well. But here's some other uses that I have for it. When I am on lower budget productions and we don't have a DIT, this becomes my DIT computer. It doesn't have the latest Thunderbolt 4 ports like I don't even know if the new M2 has Thunderbolt 4, but I know the M1 Pro and M1 Ultra MacBook Pros do. But it has two Thunderbolt 3 ports here on the side. Now, I do end up getting splitters. I'd show you. I actually have one hooked into my 5K iMac right now. But for the speed, when I need to use it as a DIT computer to offload my red footage from my Komodo using CFast 2.0 cards, or I need to offload footage from my FX30, the Canon R7, R6 in the past, my Blackmagic cameras, this computer has been a life savings with just how small, portable, the battery life. I'm able to bring it on set a lot, and since if it's a smaller set and we don't have a DIT, sometimes I don't even plug this thing in. I just make sure to charge it the night before, and I put it on a table, and I let it kind of run cards. I run cards through it as I need to, and the battery will last me all day as long as I'm literally just using it as a DIT computer if I'm not using it to do anything else. But as a DIT computer, it has been absolutely fantastic, especially on lower budget stuff. And I think the key with it is having the right dongles so you can do your DIT setup while you're on the go and make the most out of this computer, since you do only have two Thunderbolt 3 ports. So as a DIT computer, it has absolutely come in handy. Another use for it has been for live streaming. Now, as I've spoken about many times on the channel, although I don't live stream that much on the channel, even though I'm live streaming right now, I do a lot of live streaming for other companies. I do use this Canon R7 to live stream. This is one of the first live streams that I'm actually not using an HDMI capture card, and let me know in the comments below if you want me to go through that in a future video, but I'm actually using the new EOS utility that essentially lets you grab a video feed out of the USB-C port and go directly into your computer. There are some downsides, especially compared to Sony, because you don't actually get any audio into the camera, any audio out of the camera doing this method. So I'm actually having to use a USB-C audio interface as well so I can get audio into the live stream. But I have used this with the R7, with the capture card plenty of times, and the FX30, and my Komodo, and my Blackmagics, and as a portable live stream computer, this has done amazing for me as well. Just because of how small it is, the battery life. I typically don't have live streams that exceed an hour to an hour and a half, and by the time those live streams are done, I still have way more than half a battery left on the M1 MacBook Air. So I know it's a little bit of a niche use, but if you happen to do live streaming and you do need a laptop that can support the power of it, I've had a great experience with the M1 MacBook Air. It's worked really great. And then on top of that, it's so small I can just put it right in my camera bag. And now let's talk about one of the last, I guess we'll call it niche uses I have for the M1 MacBook Air. And originally, I was thinking about buying a M1 MacBook, an M1 Mac Mini, because you can get them on the used market for around $500. But I ended up using my M1 MacBook Air instead, just because I don't really use it when I'm home. And it was a great experiment because by plugging this into all of my hard drives and some of the RAID arrays I have actually in my room, what it allows me to do is you can connect your Mac to another Mac on your network, and you can actually access all of the external hard drives by doing so, and you get pretty decent transfer speeds. So with that being said, I started hooking up my M1 MacBook Air just through one of the Thunderbolt 3 drives to an extension port that has all of my drives hooked up to it, and I get just a lot of great use. I don't have to have all of these drives out here in kind of like my main working space where I do have people come through. I don't want to have a crazy cluttered desk, especially now that I'm running 2 monitors again, because this is not a 5K iMac. This is just an LED cinema display as my second monitor next to my 5K iMac that's out of frame. So yeah, it's been really useful to be able to network all of my drives and then be able to just grab footage. I've tried editing directly actually off of the network drive, and it does work, but I would say I don't recommend that. The best thing about this whole situation has been, when I need footage off of any of those drives, I can just go grab them. And I do have some really fast SSDs out here that I literally just grab them off those drives and through the network, put them on my SSDs, and it's really helped speed up my editing workflow. So that again is like a niche use for this. And then of course, whenever I'm traveling or whatever, luckily I only have one Thunderbolt plugged in here. So I just unplug it. Laptop's typically charged because of being in there, and I'm good to go. So again, niche use, but I wanted to talk about the niche uses that I've had with this specific MacBook Air, just because they're things that I didn't buy it for. Other than the live streaming, I did want to do live streaming with it, but things like networking and whatnot, I didn't buy it for, and it happened to work out really well. So I hope that by seeing this video, you could basically get a little bit more of an understanding on why the M1 MacBook Air, even here in 2022, almost 2023, is still an amazing value for what they're charging. A few more things before I wrap up. I do think at some point, especially because Apple this year actually discontinued the 5K iMac. You can get them in their refurbished store, but they're in various configurations. Excuse me. And as far as buying them front-facing from the Apple Store, you can't. And so I have a feeling, especially because you really can only purchase the M1 MacBook Air in its base model configuration at this point. Otherwise you're forced to go to the M2. I think at some point in the next year or so, they're probably going to discontinue these just because I can see them eating out of the sales of the M2 MacBook Air, especially with that whole issue with the base model I covered earlier in the video. So I'm not saying, rush out and get it right now because they're going to be discontinued. I'm just saying at some point I could see it happening because my 5K iMac was literally announced at the exact same time as this M1 MacBook Air. It's really weird how it happened. They announced the M1 MacBook Air, the M1 Mac Mini, and the M1 13-inch MacBook Pro, in addition to they announce the Apple announcing the last 5K 27-inch iMac that they were ever going to have that was Intel based. So again, that's why I kind of went for those, and I got the 5K iMac. Not to tangent too far, but I got it because of how powerful it is and how good of a deal it was. Kind of like the M1 MacBook Air at the time. It was just a crazy deal. It was basically like getting a cheaper iMac Pro. iMac Pro, not Mac Pro, but it was like getting a cheaper one. And it surprised me that they discontinued it technically less than 2 years after the computer was released. And that's why I think at some point, since this has been out longer now than the 5K iMac, I think it may have its day come to be discontinued. So, as I've been saying, I'm not necessarily saying go rush out and buy this thing if you don't need it. But if you have a use for it, there are some great deals on them right now. And for the price, if you need it, it's absolutely worth it. Especially, again, I'm going to reiterate, if you're editing in DaVinci, or if you're a content creator, editor, filmmaker, videographer, and you're editing in DaVinci or Final Cut, those two work absolutely amazing on the M1 MacBook Air. You may have noticed I kept saying those two and did not mention Premiere. I actually do not recommend editing on Premiere in the base model configurations of any of the M1 computers. If you're going to go get a spec'd out M1 computer, they can totally handle Premiere. But if you're getting a base model, Premiere kind of treats these computers like they do Intel. It's not exactly the scientific case, but I'm kind of simplifying it right now. Whereas DaVinci and Final Cut definitely optimize their use on a computer based on the actual computer itself and its hardware. So that's why I think they work the best. So this, again, was a live stream. I wanted to kind of discuss, and also I'm testing out this live stream setup as, I don't know if you caught yesterday's live stream, but I had a little issue with my audio interface where I sounded like a chipmunk. So I'm hoping when I come back to this at the end, I'm going to sound okay. But thank you, everyone who joined me on the live stream today. If you have any questions, make sure to put them in the comments below. And if you got knowledge and value out of today's video, please make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and notification bell to keep up to date with the latest videos on the channel. Till next time, my name's Jeff Fagan. Thank you for joining me, everybody, and I will see you in the next video.